All right, Benjamin Hadfield, Teach Me to Dive. We've got a special guest today. In every one of my tech classes, I have always heard the question, did you read Shadow Divers? Have you read Shadow Divers? I can't tell you how many times I've had that question. Have you read that book? Yes, I've got it in my bookshelf. I keep a bookshelf of fantastic books. So today we're honored. We've got Richie Kohler, who's a renowned technical diver and maritime explorer. He's adventured to the depths of history, not just diving, and diving into some of the world's most challenging shipwrecks. His endeavors, including the exploration of the famous German U-boat U-869, or famously called the U-Who, chronicled in that book, Shadow Divers, we just talked about, by Robert Kurson. It illuminates a lot of interesting things and a lot of big questions that we have. But he just doesn't stop there. He's got some amazing wrecks that he's hit as well. I mean, the Andrea Doria always comes to mind when you start talking about Richie, as well as my bucket list dive is always going to be the Britannic. One of these days, I'm going to be on the Britannic, and it's going to be my I Ching day. And here we are. Richie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, let's just jump right into the meat and potatoes, if you will. What initially drew you to technical diving and maritime history?
Well, I've been diving now for, it's I think over 45 years, certified diver, 45 years. Just think about that. So when I started diving, I was a little earlier than that. I was about 8 years old, and my dad had learned how to scuba dive. At the same time, the Apollo program was in full bore. Like every other boy and girl around the planet, and probably some adults too, I wanted to be an astronaut. And obviously, for a kid from Brooklyn, New York, it wasn't a far reach to realize that I could go scuba diving and become an aquanaut, and I could do that at 8 years old. My dad gave me the opportunity. He put the tanks on my back in a pool. A few years later, he would tie a rope around my back and allow me to go off the back of our family boat right at the marina. And, the joke in the family is I must have cut myself with the diving equipment, because it truly did get into my blood. My dad never became a very big or deep diver. He was always happy in 20 to 30 feet, mostly cleaning his boat, where I kind of went further afield. When I was in my teens, I started diving shipwrecks. And I was quickly noticed by some older fellows that took me under their wing and started to teach me things that we would now call technical diving. But back in the late 70s, early 1980s, there was no term technical diving. There was no mixed gas. There was no nitrox. There were no diving computers. I mean, everybody was diving air tables, and literally the tables. You used to have just a stopwatch or a bottom timer. So, depth gauge, bottom timer, and that was about it. Even a BCD was just coming into vogue when I started to dive. My dad's basic equipment was nothing more than a harness, a cylinder, a tank, and fins, and there was no buoyancy control. So that was my intro. And so I've literally grown up in diving, and I've watched the industry and the equipment and the training agencies grow with me. And so when you say technical diving, to me, it's always just been diving. It's just that a guy like Michael Menduno came up and gave it a name, technical diving. And it is a fitting moniker. But at those days, when I started, there was no one teaching advanced wreck diving. There was some wreck diving classes, which really were nothing more than an excuse for dive shops to get people to go dive in shipwrecks. But there was really no training, because most of the dives that were being done were no decompression. Most of the dives being done were being told, don't go inside, that's dangerous. And that's where this group that I bounced into in the New York and New Jersey area brought me under their wing and started to tutor me and a few other guys younger than them in the ways of surviving in an increasingly dangerous environment. And what I mean by that was this group liked to dive shipwrecks. And one of the things they liked to do on shipwrecks, besides picking up lobsters and scallops, was to find artifacts. And in New York and New Jersey, all of the wrecks that had been in 60, 70 to 100, 130 feet of water had been heavily dived in the 60s and 70s. So in the 70s and 80s, if you wanted to find artifacts, you had to go further afield, and that meant deeper. And so this group would start taking me to wrecks that were in 150, 180, and even 200 feet. We were diving this on air.
Oh my
A couple
goodness.
of, yeah, a couple of the things that they did to shake me up and around was when I first met them, I was just diving a single tank. So, of course, if you're going to start diving to 150 feet and doing decompression, you have to have enough gas or air to breathe to do your deco. And so I quickly went to twin sets. Another thing that I did was because we would then switch over to dry suits from wetsuits. Wetsuits were great in the environment. As a matter of fact, Jacques Cousteau and many of the other people who came and visited wrecks in our area were wearing wetsuits. But we started to borrow some of the equipment, and we still to this day borrow from both military and commercial. And so what I did is I got a Poseidon unisuit, which was a commercial dry suit meant for commercial divers. I had to wear 30 pounds of lead to
Oh my God.
offset the buoyancy of not only that dry suit, but the double aluminum tanks on my back. But conversely, the dry suit now acted as a buoyancy compensator. So in a way, we were, I wouldn't say ahead of our time, but we were using technology or the equipment to help us on our way. Uh, as you can probably imagine, the water here off New York and New Jersey can tend to be quite turbid and cold. So a dry suit was a must. Also, more powerful and redundant lights. It's funny that at the same time that in Florida and in other communities, the cave community was starting to establish uh, um, protocols, rules, and training to allow divers to go into subterranean caves, subterranean wet caves and come back alive. In the same way, the Atlantic wreck divers were taking me and training me in ways to go further, deeper, and go inside shipwrecks for the sake of not only the exploration, but to be more efficient.
Wow. So how long did it take you to start getting comfortable? Because as you're starting to get to 150 feet, 175 feet, and on diving in air, the weight of the gas is extremely. I mean, that you're getting up to 7.5, 8 grams per liter at that point. How long did it take you to acclimatize to that so that you were able to comfortably dive it and spend the
You,
time?
that's a really good question. And in today's environment, where a lot of technical divers are going from a little bit of deep air and then moving right into trimix. And I applaud that, by the way. The whole idea of being, I don't know if the right word would be macho or wanting to experience a narcosis. Narcosis was obviously one of the biggest problems that
Mhm.
impacted us on deep air dives, as long with also along with deep water blackout, which was a blanket term for either hyperoxia,
Mhm.
too much oxygen in the breathing mixture, or hypoxia, or CO2 hypercapnia. One of those three things would be the ultimate demise of a diver diving deep on open circuit by a badly working regulator, or breathing a mixture that was obviously too rich for them with the oxygen content. So, long story short, to answer your question, that adaptation is something that comes with time. You can't rush it. There's no zero to hero here. My journey as a diver started out like everyone else, just a sport diver, enjoying being weightless in 30 to 60 foot of water. When I started diving shipwrecks, a lot of the shipwrecks were in 80 to 90 or 130 feet. Now, 130 feet in 1980 was a deep dive.
Sure.
You would go down, you would do a 15 to 20, depending on what was on your back, whether it was a single steel tank or an aluminum tank or a twin set. Either way, you were going to do 15 minutes or 30 minutes at depth. You were going to decompress, come up, do a 2 to 3 hour surface interval, and then go back down. And so what happens is you would develop over the summer an ability to recognize and deal with narcosis. It's often said as a joke that, been there, seen that, forgot it. Which was one of the biggest problems you had, where it was like you would go down, you would get down on the rack, and then you would come back up, and only remember a third of what you had seen or experienced. So a perfect example of this, the narcosis effect, came into full play years later when John Chatterton had switched to Trimix, and I was still on the fence about it. And we dove together, him on Trimix, me on air, and we were diving to 230 feet. And John was coming behind me with the camera, and he was going to film, and I had to set the hook or tie the boat, the anchor line into the shipwreck so we can make the dive. So at the conclusion of the dive, we did the dive, we did our decompression, we come back, and we're in the salon on the boat. And John's making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And he asks me, he says, "Why did you tie in, untie, and then tie again?" And I'm like, "I didn't do that. I tied in and then went on my dive." He goes, "No, no, you tied in, you looked at it, then you untied it, and then retied it again." I go, "John, no, I didn't." He goes, "Give me," and he plays the video, on the back. And I'm looking at it. I had no recollection of that. Absolutely not. It's like I was on automatic. And that's the key, is that you become on automatic. And that automatic is a skill set that is important to obviously maintain. At that time, one of the most important things was gas supply. Time and gas supply. How much air did you have left? What time was it? Is it time to go? Do I have enough air? Can I? So there was a rhythm to breathing. I don't know. I don't think we ever counted our breaths, but there would be every 30 seconds to a minute, you would pick up your gauges, you'd look at them. And I can actually remember looking at my gauge, studying it really intensely, putting it down, and then not remembering anything I had just looked at all. That, my friend, is narcosis. And you have to pick it up again and look at it again. And so obviously, I've made many dives on wrecks like the Andrea Doria, where we would be hitting a maximum depth of 250 feet on air. Most of the time, the depths were about 220 feet. And so, yeah, you can get pretty hammered. And the other things I've noticed about narcosis is some days it hits you a lot harder than others. And this has to do with your physiology. It could do to water temperature. It could be if it was an overcast day versus a sunny day. All of these factors can really play in to how narcosis hits you one day different than another. So to get back to your question, how do you develop these skills? You just keep diving, keep practicing. Perfect practice makes perfect. Not just practice makes perfect, but going back, always trimming yourself out, always making sure everything's right, and listening to that little voice in the back of your head, the little voice on your shoulder, that if it doesn't feel right, or it doesn't seem right, it's not right. And there's no shame in turning a dive. And let me tell you, there's a lot of dives that I've gone down and I've never left the hook or the anchor line because I just didn't feel it. There's been times I've gotten down on the wreck, swam away, came right back up, just didn't feel it. And I think that we all need to listen to those voices because they're the things that I think keep us measured, keep us in control. And then you know when to push it at that point. In other words, if you are willing to listen to those voices and you've got the commensurate skill and experience, well, then you can push it a little further. And I don't mean pushing the limits of your gas supply. I don't mean that. I mean, if something seems a little scary or a little challenging, well, that's the exciting part. If you're frightened out of your wits, well, then you either don't have the skill set or the experience to be there. So it's kind of a balancing act. We all have to challenge ourselves a little bit to push a little bit further, but we don't want to be challenging ourselves outside of our abilities or experience.
Right on. So when you read Shadow Divers, you really get the sense that you are really pushing boundaries and taking really big calculated risks. How did you determine the calculation of the risk to ensure your safety?
When you look at Shadow Divers, number one, it was, the events in that were 30 years ago. Okay. I'm 62 now. I was 30 years old when those things happened. So, a 62-year-old man has a perspective of life that you don't necessarily have when you're a 30-year-old man or person. And at the time, there were different challenges over the 5 years that we worked that shipwreck. And the challenges grew exponentially as each of us, John Chatterton and myself, as well as a few other divers that were party to the project over that period of time, each of us wanted to come away with something. In the beginning, for me, it was about retrieving an artifact. I really just wanted another piece of memorabilia to put on the shelf next to all of the other artifacts. But things changed for me over time. You can't swim inside this broken submarine gliding over the remains, the skeletal remains of a 56-man crew, some of them still in their tattered uniforms, and not come away touched by that. You have to deal with your own morality and mortality at this moment. And so I felt over time, not overnight, but maybe over a year or two, as the more that I would read historical books about the Battle of the Atlantic, about the U-boats, the more that I saw photographs of these young sailors, going to sea and never coming home, I realized that John and I had a unique opportunity, and that unique opportunity was to make a difference, to do something, not because you wanted an artifact for yourself, but that you could make a difference in someone's life, that we would have the ability to knock on someone's door and not tell them what they knew. They knew that in 1945 their loved one didn't come home. But we had the opportunity to knock on someone's door and tell them where their loved ones were, and that the people that found them treated them with respect. And that was, for me, a slow and hard-learned epiphany. And so when you ask me why we would take challenges, we learned early on that neither the German government, the American government, no expert, no historian, no archivist could answer the simple question, which submarine was this and how did it wind up off the coast of New Jersey? And as we, over time, got to know these experts and historians, they kept telling us the same thing. The answer's on the wreck. You have to go back there. And so John, on one hand, was a very meticulous researcher. He was a very disciplined diver, and he felt that the wreck was beating him, that this wreck was keeping its identity a secret from him, was fighting him. Of course, we know that's not the case. The wreck, the reality is the wreck will give its answers when it's ready. It's that simple. It's not, if it was that easy, we would have been done with it in 6 weeks. But instead, it took nearly 6 years. And it was a difficult road. And so what happened was, as the challenges got harder, we rose to them. So where some people would say, well, we took unnecessary chances, I would point to you and say that when John decided to take his tanks off, let me rephrase. When John decided to dive 2 sets of single tanks and then take a single tank and go into this obstruction at 230 feet with a very limited amount of gas, I was not going to do. I said, you're out of your mind. I says, and I don't want to be part of this, because if anything goes wrong, you're dead and I can't help you. And I am not going to do this. I had at that time 2 small children that were depending on daddy to come home. And although some people would look at the diving that I was doing and say, that's incredibly risky, I would say it was risky, but I was managing the risk. And so we all have a line of risk that we're willing to manage. And to some people, that not a line they're comfortable crossing. So even in a team as John and I, he went over a line that I wasn't comfortable crossing. Ultimately, I did support him in this endeavor with the understanding that if I didn't support him, he would probably do it, and then I would never forgive myself if he died and I wasn't there. Not that I would have been of much help, but I just couldn't abandon him and the project. So I don't know if that's a good enough answer for you about why we do the things we do. But the reality is that once you've realized you can make a difference in people's lives with your diving career, it becomes something that now is a whole new thing to ascend to. It is much more satisfying than bringing home a bag full of lobsters or a porthole from a shipwreck, when you can do things that really have a great impact in other people.
Let's talk about that for a moment. So you enter the Yoo-hoo, the 869, and you're swimming over the remains of these German soldiers. And certainly while they were on the opposite side, they were certainly men that were fighting for their country and doing what they thought was right. Tell me about the first time you were able to identify one of them and put somebody's family to ease, that you've come across their loved one.
Well, it's a kind of a detailed answer, but the reality is that, I've always, John would tell you right now if he was here, that for him, it was about solving the mystery. It was about putting this to bed, correcting broken history. And we did it. For me, it was a lot more than that. John had found a knife on the wreck, and it was the first thing. As a matter of fact, it was the only object that we ever recovered from the shipwreck that had a sailor's name on it. And when we went to the German experts at the U-boat archive and showed them the name, they said, "Oh, wow, this is a really unique name. There was only one fellow in the entire German Navy, 40,000 German submariners, and only one guy had this name." Unfortunately, that guy died off of North Africa, so the knife and the name was a red herring. Obviously, a few years later, and I don't want to ruin it for anybody who hasn't read the book, but we found out a few years later that wasn't the fact. And so when we positively identified the wreck, it was only then that I decided to fly to Germany, and I worked with Der Spiegel, which is a news organization, to help me locate some of the families. And I did wind up meeting with many of them. To this day now, I have been in contact with 17 of the 56 men families. And when each of them, when I met them, the very first, and I told them the story, the very first thing they always did was they were so sad to hear that 3 divers lost their lives during the process of trying to identify this shipwreck. And I was always grateful for that. And then they would, and many times, just hug me and be so grateful that the divers who found their loved ones treated them with respect. And you touched on something earlier that I want to say. In 1945, the vile Nazi regime and the U-boats that sailed for them were our enemy. And if it was 1945, as an American, I would have not lavished it, but it would have been my job to kill them.
Sure.
But in 1991, when we found them, they were unknown, lost people. And how do you walk away from that? Even if you knew, as we did, that they were members of the Third Reich or they were German sailors serving under the Nazi flag, do you walk away? Where is your morality? In hindsight and 70 years later, do you treat them with disrespect? There were some people that would actually say to me, they're the enemy, they were Nazis. And I'm like, no, actually, they were like 18 and 20-year-old kids who died. And somewhere, somehow, I would like to let their families know that we found them.
Sure.
Because this was an enigma. Again, nobody knew who they were or where they had come from. And once we figured that out, I felt that I had an obligation to contact those families and tell them what had happened to them.
That is amazing. So could you share one of the most unforgettable memories you have of the exploration of 869?
Probably one of the most profound memories I have, which stays with me, was the very first time I went in and I saw the human remains. I was absolutely frightened. I'm not going to lie. I was, the narcosis pounding in my head. I had been diving at that point for shipwrecks for almost a decade. And on many of them, like the Andrea Doria, there was loss of life. But you never see that. You never see the bones. You never see the human remains. The sea absorbs them. all you see is, shoes, dishes, eyeglasses, things that may indicate that people were there, but you never see people. But not in the submarine. In the submarine, it was painfully obvious. I mean, like a horror show. And it was hard for me at first to wrestle with that this was not the Pirates of the Caribbean ride in Disneyland. This was the real deal. These were human beings. I had never seen that before. I had never seen skeletal remains. And it took me a while to steel my nerves to keep going in further and further. And on one dive, the one in particular that I want to share with you, I had gone into an area of the petty officers' uh, uh, space,
Hmm.
and I saw a piece of white sticking out of the silt, and I believed it to be the bottom of a bowl. And so I reached into the silt and I pulled it up, and as I pulled it up, it was a human skull. And as I pulled it up, the silt was coming out of the eye sockets, and the remains of teeth were there. And my first instinct was to scream and throw it. I mean, like just scream horror. But
Sure.
at the same moment, because it wasn't the very first time, I had come in there a few times. I apologized. I had literally had not a verbal conversation, but in my mind, I had a conversation, and I was so sorry. And I felt horrible for disturbing this person. And I then put him back towards the side, as if he could look out over his uh, com- compatriots in that compartment. And I just turned around and I got out of there. And I'm like, what am I doing? What am I doing? And it was at that moment, I think, was the beginning for me, where it wasn't about stuff, and the stuff that we were going to be getting. We now had to think about how we were going to work it. And what I mean by that is when we met the author of the book Shadow Divers, Robert Kurson, he asked a question, and it kind of sticks with me. He says, "So you're telling me that the answer might have been in one of those uniforms that you saw on these skeletons? You could have reached in their pocket, and maybe they had a lighter, or they would have had jewelry or something that would have had the answer, and you refused to do that." I said, "Yeah." At that point, it was like the touching the human remains, digging around human remains, disturbing human remains was off limits. We had to find another way. And he goes, "Why?" And I go, "Well, how do you ultimately look at someone and say, I answered this mystery, but in order to do so, I had to disturb what could have been your son or your brother?" Or at that point, it's not that it wasn't worth it. It was always worth it to figure it out, but there had to be a better way. And so that's when we started looking at the schematics and really becoming more, dare I use the word detectives, in that we were going to approach this in a forensic way. And so we had to make deductions, and those deductions were to start limiting of the 700 U-boats sunk during World War II. We had to limit that down to one. And so we had to start doing that by finding objects that would help us determine where the submarine was built, what type of submarine it was, what date had it set sail. And these are items that we would be able to recover from the shipwreck and do so without disturbing the human remains.
That's a sombering experience, to say the least. That's for sure. Basically, you're diving a cemetery, an honor cemetery where men who are working for their country died and perished. So your involvement in Discovery it's widely known, and we all appreciate that. What was the most surprising aspect of this submarine's wreckage when you went back and revisited it in 2020?
Well, we always know, all of us know that shipwrecks age just like people. They biologically implode. As much as people would like to believe that the beautiful and grand Titanic will remain upright and in perfect condition in its current state of decay, that's not the case. One day, explorers will go down, and even the grand Titanic will be nothing more than a rust stain on the bottom of the seafloor. And this U-boat is no different. The challenges that faced us and the obstructions and the difficulty are now minimized in many different ways. The first and most important is that when I dove it back in the 1990s, we were using open circuit technology, and then the advent of trimix came into play. And so diving to 230 feet became somewhat safer. Although we had a finite amount of gas, we were now carrying more gas. So we had bottom gas that we would use, which extended our bottom time and made it safer by lowering the oxygen content, lowering the nitrogen content, replacing it with helium, making us actually more efficient and safer. By carrying decompression gases, we now extended our range. So now instead of doing 15 or 20 minutes, we were doing 30 or 40-minute bottom times on open circuit. When I visited it recently, I was now doing 1 hour dives because now I'm using closed circuit rebreathers. When I went inside the wreck, I was shocked and also dismayed to see that, of course, it's filled up even more with silt and sand. And many of the obstructions that had limited our ability to find the answers have now fallen down. So maybe if we had found it 20 years later, we would have had a much easier time of solving the mystery, thanks to not only the wreck falling apart, but also the advances in technology. So that's an incredible eye opener. And on that recent dive, not recent, but a few years ago, when I was there, I was diving with Andrew Nagel, the son of Bill Nagel, who was like a 8-year-old boy when all of the events that were going on in shadow divers. He was 8 years old. And now, as a young man with a son of his own, I got to dive with him. And that was a really wonderful experience to see, life goes on, and him following in a good way in his father's footsteps.
That's amazing. And that had to have been a really neat thing to be able to take him on his first dive in that as well.
It was our first dive together, and that was on the U-869, the submarine that his father had found. Yeah.
So how has your perspective of deep sea exploration evolved since your first dives on this back in the 90s?
Well, the Cliff Notes version of it is that two things happened concurrently while we were working on U-869. The first was prior to ever understanding its identity. It was still then known as the U-Who. We started working with a film crew that was helping facilitate our dive trips by helping us with the fuel cost. In the last 2 years, a lot of the people that were diving the wreck in the beginning waned off. There was no money. There was no more notoriety to it. They just moved along. But John and I wanted to figure it out. We wanted to be able to positively prove which submarine this was. And so there were a lot of trips where John and I just pretty much chartered the boat by ourselves. It was just me and him paying the freight. And so when a film crew came along and offered to help, well, we were more than willing to have them help us pay the fuel bill. And so they started to film us. And then obviously, as time went by and we ultimately identified the submarine, they were there, they captured this, and it became an award-winning, Emmy-winning documentary known as Hitler's Lost Sub. That documentary set into motion two things that, would ultimately change my life. And I think in many ways, the events of shadow divers and our conduct on that submarine are in no small part one of those forks in your life where, your life was heading in one direction, but now all of a sudden, because of your actions, you don't see it at the time, but you just go off in a different direction. And so the two things that changed were film executives at A&E in New York City watched and saw Hitler's Lost Sub, this documentary, and invited John and I into New York and discussed with us the possibility of working for them on a television program called Deep Sea Detectives. At the same time, a gentleman from Chicago, a writer, had seen the same program and called us up and said, "This sounds like a crazy story. I got to meet you guys." Well, that person was Rob Kurson. And so as we started working for the History Channel and started hosting a television show, he started working on a book. So, within 3 years, we are now working on television. We had done 4 seasons, 56 episodes of Deep Sea Detectives. We started producing our own underwater documentary films, including on Titanic and Britannic, as well as a number of other projects. And then, of course, Shadow Divers comes out and becomes an international hit. It becomes a New York Times bestseller. All of a sudden, John and I are, back on the news. We're on news programs, and so, it was the halcyon days of notoriety, both for our performance on the submarine, but also for the fact that we really love diving shipwrecks and we really love making a difference. It's not only about going out there and being a tourist, but if you can come back and, I like to say that if we can inspire, educate, and maybe even entertain, well, then we've won. We have won across the board. Because what better way than to inspire a next generation, educate people, and entertain? And of course, there's always the naysayers. There's the people that are like, oh, you did a show on the Andrea Doria, and everybody knows what happened to the Andrea Doria. It's like, okay, you know what happened to the Andrea Doria. But is that 18-year-old kid behind you know? He probably never heard of it. So my whole point is education is ongoing for generation after generation after generation. So, where some people didn't particularly care for the History Channel programming, I was very happy to be part of it because I thought, and I still do to this day, think that, our biggest responsibility as explorers are to inspire the generation behind us. Because remember, every explorer is stepping into the footsteps of someone who came before them, and they just push that flag a little bit further. And I'd like to think that behind me, I've inspired someone to follow in my footsteps and go even further.
I agree. That's absolutely amazing. So you brought up a kind of an interesting point. We always have this idea that you see the book, that there must have been millions of dollars and all this, but you're funding this yourself, and the Yoo-hoo she's a little farther out there. She's 60 miles, right?
60 miles from Point Pleasant, off of Atlantic City, New Jersey.
So how are you funding all this?
At that time, we were, I still own a glass company. I fix windows. That's my day job, if you will. John Chatterton at the time was a commercial diver, and we would basically, use the milk money, if you will. I don't think I need to tell you that diving can tend to be, an expensive hobby. And yeah. I've never let common sense or expense get in my way. So.
Fair enough. That's always the big question. I mean, and you've been lucky enough to work on this and to expand out of that where it actually made some money, but that's amazing. So last question, because I know you're pressed for time a bit, but the pursuit of identifying the Yoo-hoo, the 869, pushed the dive team to its absolute limit. It impacted personal lives. There was marriages that were lost. How did the experience change your approach to diving and exploration?
John was, and still is to some degree, much more of the daredevil or person willing to experiment. When I met John and I started working with him, I was quite pragmatic. And to some degree, I'm still pragmatic. But one of the things that my takeaway would be is that I became a lot more open to accepting some types of new technology and pushing the envelope a little bit. If you had told me in 1985 that there will be a time where I would be using the same device on my back that astronauts use when they spacewalk, and I'd be able to stay underwater if I desired up to 12 or 14 hours, I would say that you better put that wacky weed down because you're crazy. It would have seemed like the stuff of dreams, but that's the reality. That's where we are today. If you had told me that I'd be regularly making dives in excess of 400 feet, I'd also think you were crazy because I thought that that magic line was right there at 250. So technology and techniques being advanced, sometimes with painful cost, but being advanced, pushing that line forward. It's important that we learn from those lessons and that we build upon them and that we're cognizant of the fact that, you know, change is inevitable and we should embrace not change for the sake of change, but change for the sake of safety and advancement. And so that's where I think that I had a big change in who I am as a man, as a person, as a diver.
I'd like to pop up a little segment of your 869 Yoo-hoo, just so we've got some perspective on this. And just, if you would, I'm just going to mute it on the screen so it doesn't make any sound. And just give me a few thoughts and share a little bit about what we're looking at.
Sure.
So tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here.
Okay, so we are about to enter into the forward torpedo room. That is a round circular hatch. And, you know, if you look in the book Shadow Divers, you'll realize that a diver with twin sets on his back just barely fits in.
Sure.
And you can see how the compartment is filled with silt and debris. Everything's kind of broken down. All of the fixtures and fittings have fallen down. All of the woodwork is gone. And to the right side of the screen now, you're going to see the remains of one of the G7E electric torpedoes. So that is the remains of a very dangerous torpedo. The inside of this compartment is, again, choked with silt, and it's just laying all over everything. And
that torpedo, were you a little worried? I mean, this is live ordnance.
It is live ordnance, but I'm fortunate in understanding that they did not put the detonators in until they were just about ready to load them. So that torpedo, although it is loaded with Torpex or high explosive, the detonator is not in it. So, you know, you think of the old Bugs Bunny cartoons, no, you don't have to worry about hitting the front of it with a hammer. But as you as you continue to go forward here, you can see these two rails on either side of above us. Those are the rails that would help load the torpedoes into the torpedo tubes, which we're heading towards right now. But at the same time, you'll see that the silt is rising and rising because it's just been building up. And when John Chatterton, and in the distance you can make out the two circular torpedo tubes. There's two more of them, and they're down below in that silt. When John had gone in here 25 years ago, you could see all four torpedo tubes. So that's, really? Yeah, now you're going to get an idea of what the silt is like. So now as you turn around, you can see how viscous and dirty the silt is. And as we're exiting the submarine here, now I'm turning around. I'm just panning and showing you all of the remains of some of the equipment that has been just totally eroded by its 70 plus years underwater. There's all kinds of gauges and fittings and flanges. And so now I'm going to slip back in, and the visibility is really bad on the way out. But I think we're going to just jump ahead.
Whoop. Oh. And right into a commercial.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue anyway, right there. That's extremely interesting. So how deep was the silt?
In the forward part of the compartment, it's probably every bit of 3 to 4 feet.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And in the back end, it's probably about 2 feet. So it kind of goes up from 2 feet to 4 feet. And I think that's just from the natural flow of water through the open hatch that kind of pushes it up into the corner.
You're squeezing through this. That's amazing. Well, Richie, I appreciate your time today. It's been amazing, and I'd like to reserve the right to do further interviews with you as time goes by, if that would be okay.
I'd be more than happy to.
Perfect. Well, Rich, thank you for coming on. Again, my name is Benjamin Hadfield. I'm a technical dive instructor and interviewing Richie Kohler, made famous by undersea detectives, as well as Hitler's Lost Sub, and of course, everybody's favorite Shadow Divers. Keep that on your shelf. If you haven't got the book, you should. But Richie, what's next for Richie? What are you working on?
Well, for the last, 17 years now, I've been working on the wreck of the Titanic's sister ship, which is in 400 feet of water off the small Greek island of Kea. It is truly one of my favorite shipwrecks. And as you said, it's on your list of to-do dives. It's just visually stunning. The visibility out there is incredible. At times, we've had over 200 foot of visibility. And I got to tell you, being at 100 foot on the descent, looking down and seeing the side of Britannic's, the same ship, as you're descending, and you realize I'm 200 feet above this wreck and I can see it. And then the wreck, laying on its side, rises 100 feet off the seafloor. So it is an incredibly visually stunning and awe-inspiring thing. And for many years, we've been working on it, trying to solve. We did ultimately solve one of the big mysteries of why the ship sank so quickly. And now we're working with the Greek government and other agencies and the ship's owner, given permission to go inside and film many of the secrets that are inside this shipwreck. And it's just been the creme de la creme on my incredible and fortunate diving career to be able to dive Britannic.
We're going to have to revisit an interview on that, because that is my dream wreck. So now there is the floating mystery out there, the question, and briefly, where do you fall on that this is actually the Titanic, not the Britannic?
I'm going to say that the British had a lot of problems on their hand, but falsifying what ship was what. There's an old expression, how 3 people keep a secret? You kill 2 of them, right? That's the only way. So there's absolutely no way that the Harlan and Wolff, the builders of the ship, the White Star Line, would have this kind of thing go on. If they wanted to replace a ship, they would simply replace it, and then there was no need for all the subterfuge of changing ships out. Yeah. So I don't buy into that myself.
That's fun. Well, Richie, thank you for your time. I appreciate you greatly. It's been amazing, absolutely amazing. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about the Britannic, and hopefully maybe I can get out there and dive with you one of these days. But that'd be the absolute dream.
My favorite way to meet people.
Absolutely.
And to everybody, happy holidays to you all.
Happy holidays. Absolutely. Well, again, Benjamin Hadfield, teach me to dive, technical dive instructor in Idaho and teaching in Florida as well. Interviewing Richie. If you like this kind of content, of course, subscribe, hit the like button. You know the drill. Make sure to do that and subscribe. Make sure to go check out Richie's channel, and he's got an upcoming movie coming up that they're working on about the Britannic. So we're going to definitely, when that comes out, we're going to publicize the heck out of that, because that's just the dream come true. Again, thank you so much.